All right, let's discuss the Pacific Coast Hockey Association. This was a league that tried. What happened is really it lost the battle because of money. It's usually the way it works. And some greed in there too. So, the Patrick brothers, who had a family dynasty of sorts, decided, let's start a hockey league. Let's risk our entire family fortune on it. It was risky, but it was a risk that they felt that they should take because they loved hockey. So, I give credit to them for that, for taking that risk. Victoria, New West, and Vancouver are in, but New West also played in Vancouver because they didn't have an arena yet. Didn't have an arena that was qualified. Victoria and Vancouver, indoor arenas, which were unusual at the time. Because, of course, with the climate on the West Coast here, you can't have ice rinks. It's just not going to work. So the first season, the Victoria Royals, or New Westminster Royals, finished with a 9-6 record. They finished first in the league. And for whatever reason, Hockey Database didn't have these all completely in order the first few years. And I didn't feel like writing it all out. But yeah, it was the Victoria Aristocrats. Although when I double checked on that, it was actually the Senators for the first 2 years of their existence. So this is whatever. So the Victoria Senators, who would become the Aristocrats later, New Westminster Royals, and the Vancouver Millionaires. And of the three, the Millionaires are the team that people remember. 1912-13, Victoria finishes first, thus winning the league. There's no playoffs. New West 6-9, Vancouver 7-9, Victoria 10-5. So it wasn't even close. So I can't imagine there was a ton of excitement. There was 4,000 seats in the Victoria Arena. There were 10,500 in the Vancouver Arena. And as I covered this morning, when the Stanley Cup got to Vancouver, they managed to squeeze over 11,000 into that stadium. So percentages of above 100% for attendance were invented by Vancouver. There you go. I don't know if that's true. I'm just throwing that out there. 1913-14, Victoria wins again. 10-5, New West 7-9, Vancouver 7-9. So, not really much change there other than New West goes above, or New West has a one game better record than they had the year before. So Victoria is the dominant team. In 1914-15, which is interesting because in 1914, the NHA agreed. National Hockey Association, remember, this is when Eddie Livingstone was in there. They had agreed to have a challenge for the Stanley Cup. The Stanley Cup didn't belong to the NHL. It was a championship trophy in Canada to decide the best team in Canada. That was it. So they decided that Pacific Coast Hockey Association had it had a solid enough base of players to warrant qualifying them as challengers for the NHL's trophy. And in 1915, the Vancouver Millionaires won the Stanley Cup. They were 13-4 that year. Victoria was 4-13. New Westminster ceased to exist. The Portland Rosebuds came in and were 9-9 that first season. So Portland had a professional hockey team. And the whole way along, they were trying to raid the NHL. So they were trying to get the NHL's big players. Newsy Lalonde, who was a big star at the time, came over and played for a while in the PCHL or PCHA, and then ended up returning to play for the Montreal Canadiens. And, of course, I'm pretty sure he's in the Hall. 1915-16, Portland, and this is where Hockey Database had all the standings out of order. Portland finished 13-5 and won the league. Seattle and Vancouver were tied with 9-9 records, and Victoria was next at 5-13. So Victoria fell on hard times, and of course at this point they're the Aristocrats. I don't know. I can't prove that going from Senators to Aristocrats changed their fortunes, but Aristocrats is not a great name. 1916-17, Seattle wins the Stanley Cup. 24 games, 16 wins and 8 losses. Vancouver, 14 wins and 9 losses. Portland, 9 wins and 15 losses. Spokane Canaries joined the league. And the Spokane Canaries were 8-15 that year. So there you go. Spokane was in the league. In an attempt to bring in more money, they expand, they try new locations, they try different things to mixed results. Spokane would leave after that 1 year, and in 1917-18, the league finally has playoffs. The second place and first place team would play off to decide who went to the Stanley Cup final that year. Seattle, Vancouver, Portland. So Vancouver, as a second place team, beats Seattle, moves on to the Stanley Cup. 1918-19, Seattle does it to Vancouver. Their second place team, they win the playoff round against Vancouver. 1919-1920, Seattle wins both the regular season and the playoffs. Notice Victoria is stuck in the bottom here after they came back from Portland. So Portland didn't work out. They go back to Victoria. And they're still the Victoria Aristocrats. 1920-21, Seattle finishes second. Vancouver is the first place team, beats them in the playoffs, moves on to the Stanley Cup. 1921-22, Vancouver finished second, but beat Seattle in the playoffs to move on to the Stanley Cup. 1922-23, Vancouver changes their name to the Vancouver Maroons. The Victoria Cougars are born as well. So they're no longer the Aristocrats, they're the Cougars. Seattle, the Mets, are right here, 15-15, last place. You'll notice that there's two teams above 500 and one at 500 because they played an interlocking schedule the last 2 years the league existed with the West Coast Hockey League because you need more leagues. And I'm going to do a video on the West Coast Hockey League because even though it didn't exist for very long, it did play a role in the NHL's emergence in the States, of all things. In the last year that the league existed, Seattle is first, Vancouver's second, Victoria's third. Vancouver would win the league that year, they'd win the playoffs that year to go on to the Stanley Cup, and that would be the end of it. The Maroons and the Cougars, so Vancouver and Victoria, joined the West Coast Hockey League when the league decided to fold after Seattle bowed out. Seattle's like, all right, we can't do this anymore. They couldn't compete with the salaries. And Vancouver and Victoria couldn't see any reason to have a league of two teams. So they moved to the West Coast Hockey League, and the league became the Western Hockey League. Not the same Western Hockey League you're thinking of either. The interesting thing with this league, you look at the top five, and I just included the top five leading scorers in the league's history. Cyclone Taylor, 130 games, 159 goals, 104 assists, 263 points. Cyclone Taylor. So when you hear about Cyclone Sports in Vancouver, that's what it's about. Tommy Dunderdale, 241 games, 194 goals, 60 assists, 254 points. Again, you'll notice a lot more goals than assists. Smokey Harris, 252 games, 156 goals, 90 assists, 246 points. Mickey McKay, 192 games, 159 goals, 82 assists, 241 points. Bernie Morris, 167 games played, 155 goals, 76 assists, 231 points. What this league did that no other league had done before, they introduced the blue lines and the goal creases. The NHL did not do that. Neither did the NHA. Forward passes, they brought that in. They also had a rover, which isn't on here. Rover, basically you have your three forwards, your two defensemen, and a rover that just chooses where to play in between. And ever since I heard about that position, that's what I call somebody if I'm playing floor hockey or road hockey, and they're just all over the place. I'm like, oh, he's decided to be the rover today. And for people who played street hockey, road hockey with me a few weeks ago, I did say that about a few people. Penalty shots were introduced by this league. The playoff format, the idea of having playoffs to decide a winner was invented here. Remember, the first couple of years with the NHL, if the same team finished first in both halves, there was no playoff. It was only to decide who was the better team between the two that finished first. Same team finishes first twice, you move on to the Stanley Cup. And they removed the goalie standing rule. I talked about that the other day, that goalies had to stand up. They weren't allowed to leave their feet. So guys like Clint Benedict were forced to just sort of dive and fall over and flop. And whoops, I fell over. So the Pacific Coast League understood that was a really stupid rule, and they got rid of it. They decided the goalies were allowed to leave their feet. So there you go. Pacific Coast Hockey Association, or a league that you're not going to hear a lot about because they went out of business back in 1924. So it's understandable we don't hear much about them, being from 94 years ago, minimum and all. I don't think there's going to be any PCHA fans watching this, but it is interesting because it did set the groundwork for some other things. I'll get into the West Coast League because the West Coast League, which became the WHL, played until 1926. And I will discuss other professional leagues that existed, defunct leagues that are gone as well, while I'm doing this series. But it's an interesting league because you do have the Vancouver Millionaires, you do have Victoria in here, and you do have Seattle. And the NHL is looking at Seattle as expansion. This is why a lot of people think, well, why not just call them the Mets? They're the Seattle Metropolitans from here till here. So why not? But hey, they'll likely come up with another name. It's probably going to be a lot better than a team name that's qualified as a name of a division. That would be tough. The Seattle Metropolitans are playing the Metropolitan Division leading. That's a disqualifier, I guess. But there you go. The PCHA. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. I'll talk to you again soon.